Thank you very much, Claire. Good afternoon, everyone, and good afternoon to the panelists. Reference was made in the previous panel discussion to South Africa's negotiated settlement. I participated in those negotiations and was also involved in the anti-apartheid struggle that preceded the negotiations as a member of the African National Congress. And in the course of the struggle, we viewed a negotiated settlement with the minority regime as inconceivable, as unimaginable. And of course, the regime viewed a negotiated settlement with the ANC as unimaginable. When we look back at our negotiated settlement in South Africa, it seems inevitable. And this is a fairly common experience where negotiated settlements that once appeared to be inconceivable and unimaginable subsequently come to be seen as inevitable. Now, I'm not going to dare to say to you that this is necessarily true of North Korea. But the challenge for us is to imagine, in this panel discussion, to imagine a negotiated solution. We want, in this discussion, to envisage a resolution to the North Korean crisis, or at least a containment of the crisis, through negotiations. And in order to do this, we have to think about negotiations both as an objective and as a strategy. If we view negotiations as an objective, then we have to identify the strategies that would create a political climate conducive to negotiations. And if we view negotiations as a strategy, then we have to think about what the realistic objectives of those negotiations would be. In other words, we have to try and identify not an ideal outcome, but rather more modestly, the elements of the most feasible negotiated settlement that would be acceptable to all the main actors. So I say that by way of setting the stage for our discussion. These introductory remarks create the framework. I will very briefly introduce each of our panelists. If you wish to see their full bios, you can have a look at the SIL website. I'm then going to put one question to each of the panelists in turn, and after that, it's an open discussion. I encourage the panelists to build on what each other have said and encourage them, since we're in a university, to disagree with each other. And we also hope to build on the discussion that took place in the preceding panel. So moving from my immediate left, we have Professor Eileen Babbitt, Director of the, who's already been well introduced. Thank you. Director of the Institute for Human Security and Professor of Practice of International Conflict Analysis and Resolution at Fletcher, at Tufts. And then we have, next to her, Ambassador Joseph Nye, who was formerly the US Special Envoy for the six-party talks with North Korea, and subsequently president of the Daniel Morgan Graduate School of National Security. And then we have Professor Antonia Chase, Tony Chase, Professor of Practice of International Politics and Law, also at Fletcher, at Tufts. Then moving to Ambassador Mark Lippert, who has a distinguished career in the US administration, including, most importantly for our purposes, as US Ambassador to South Korea from 2014 to 2017. And then right at the end, we have Ms. Suzanne DiMaggio, who is Director of the US-Iran Initiative and Senior Fellow at the organization New America. And I'm going to start with Suzanne because she has recently had interaction with North Koreans. This is through an initiative known as Track to Diplomacy, which is unofficial diplomacy. In this case, it took place this year in Oslo between North Korean officials and US experts. And so I think it'd be helpful if you could kick us off, Suzanne, by talking about how the North Koreans view the prospect of negotiations.
Great. Let me first begin by thanking the organizers and our hosts for putting together such a terrific program, in-depth program. First panel, I learned quite a lot, and I look forward to hearing my panel mates. So first, let me just clarify. What I'm going to present is my assessment based on a series of discussions I've had with North Korean officials over the past 2 years. These discussions have taken place in Pyongyang and also in European capitals. but they are not relaying what the North Koreans said. It's simply my impressions of what I think could be possible and what I think I'm hearing. So let me begin by saying, as was, I think, stated in the first panel, the North Koreans eventually want to come back to the table. My sense is they recognize that they have to come back to the table at some point because we are quickly approaching a crisis. I think I also agree with the first panel. A couple of people said that the North Koreans want direct conversations with the United States before moving to a multilateral forum, and I completely agree with that. In fact, I would say they probably want to have the U.S. what I would call talks about talks first before moving into negotiations. This is a model that the U.S. Carried out with the Iranians, where over the course of, I think, 19 meetings, which were held secretly, U.S. and Iranian officials met, not informally, but outside of the negotiating table. A lot of these meetings took place in Oman. And this was an opportunity for them to come together and talk about what the objectives of negotiations would be, what would be on the table, what would be off the table. And I'm convinced if we didn't have the talks about talks first, we would have never gotten to a JCPOA. And given the massive amount of distrust between Pyongyang and Washington, I think it's actually a good model to follow. So there are two questions of whether or not the North Koreans are going to come back to the table. One relates to timing, and the second relates to substance. So in terms of timing, I do agree with some of the previous statements. The North Koreans are waiting to get to the point where they can demonstrate that they can hit the United States with a nuclear-tipped missile, ICBM. This is also a way to strengthen their negotiating position. So it safeguards the regime from attack, and it also puts them in a position of strength when they come back to the table. So the question is to ask is, do they feel satisfied with the progress that they've made so far enough to come back to the table? I don't think so. I think they still have a few tests left to do. I don't think it's a matter of weeks, probably a matter of months if it's played correctly. There are some intervening factors that I'll get into, but if it's played well, I think that's ultimately what could happen, and that is a big thing. In terms of substance, they've made it clear that denuclearization is off the table. They're cagey about it. Sometimes they say it's off the table forever. Sometimes they say, well, we'll have to see how things go. But for now, in the short term, it's an unrealistic prospect. So I think we need to move beyond it, not abandon it as an end goal, but move on to things that focus on de-escalation and also how to get official negotiations started. In the meantime, what I've just described is not happening in a vacuum, of course. There are what I call intervening factors. There's the risk of accidental war. This could be brought about through a miscalculation or a misreading on the North Koreans' part. I do disagree with, I think, Lee, who said the president's tweets or the North Koreans see them as bluffs. I don't really see it that way. I think the combination of some of the tweeting that express a preference for military options in my mind when I read them, plus against the backdrop of increased heightened military actions on our parts. For example, overflights of B-1 bombers, which is a real irritant for the North Koreans, I can tell you that. So it's that combination of escalatory rhetoric and increased military maneuvers that I think could lead the North Koreans to think that something is imminent and maybe they need to do something about it first. So that's one scenario. The second is there's a lot more talk in Washington these days about kinetic action against Pyongyang, whether it's hitting a missile that's about to launch on the launch pad or intercepting one while it's up in the air. I think more and more people are discussing this, and of course, President Trump has demanded more options from the military along this scope. So I think that's also something we have to keep in mind. From the perspective of the North Koreans, I think there are additional challenges now that have been brought into the mix, and I'll end here. First is President Trump's undercutting of the chief diplomat of the United States, Secretary Tillerson, and basically saying diplomacy is a waste of time. This sends a strong message to the North Koreans about whether or not it's valuable to enter into discussions now. Second is the decertification of the Iran deal, which I think is supposed to happen or be announced any moment now. This sends a clear message to the North Koreans to question the U.S. credibility and commitment to any deal we would conclude with the North Koreans. Why should they do that when we are an unreliable partner? And then the third is Trump's erratic behavior itself and the mounting problems he's facing at home. I'm thinking specifically about the investigation into Russian collusion, the Mueller investigation. The North Koreans, I'm sure, are sitting back watching this and saying, will he be president much longer? And if not, why should we enter into negotiations with the U.S. at this time? So it's already such a tough, enormous amount of, I think, diplomatic energy and time to try to convince the North Koreans to come back to the table. But these intervening factors, which I would call self-inflicted on the president's part, make it all the more difficult.
Thank you. Joseph, I want to bring you in here because I think you're probably the only person in the room who's actually been involved in direct formal negotiations with North Korea. The UN Security Council, when it imposed sanctions most recently on North Korea, or additional sanctions, called for a resumption of the six-party talks. From your experience, what light would you shed on negotiations going forward? What's the path towards negotiations in the light of what you learned during the six-party talks?
Well, thank you for the question, and thank you for the Center for Ethics and the Rule of Law at the University of Pennsylvania. This is a great session. And thank you for being here, and thank you for being so interested in this very, very important issue. We're at an inflection point with North Korea, and it's important that all of us engage in this conversation and understand all aspects to it. Extremely important. Look, my experience with the North Koreans go back to 2003, as you said, with the six-party talks, and that started in August of 2003. And I think if we remember, just a few months before that, it was the Chinese who brought the U.S. to the table with North Korea in April of 2003 to establish a six-party process. Why? Because North Korea, just prior to April of 2003, was reprocessing over 8,000 spent fuel rods that were in the cooling pond because the agreed framework was dead. And they pulled out of the NPT. And we stopped building the light water reactors at Kumho, which we committed to with the agreed framework. And we stopped shipping heavy fuel oil, which we committed to with the agreed framework. So that was over. So the North Koreans took out the spent fuel rods. They started reprocessing, and they said, by the way, we're making fissile material for nuclear weapons. We got concerned. Our Secretary of State, Colin Powell at the time, reached out to the Chinese, Li Jiaxing, brought the North Koreans to the table, and that was the beginning of the six-party process. The six-party process was unique in many regards. It certainly wasn't the first time we were engaging with the North Koreans. We had the agreed framework. That was very important. We had the Perry process, 1999, 2000, when we had former Secretary of State Albright, Madeleine Albright in Pyongyang for 16 hours meeting with Kim Jong-il, the father of Kim Jong-un. With the Perry process, we had Vice Marshal Joe in the White House meeting with President Clinton, and President Clinton was literally almost on the plane to go to Pyongyang, except issues in the Middle East. So there's a lot of history here, ladies and gentlemen. We've had a lot of contact. So we, coming in 2003, we were benefited because we knew the issues before us. We knew this was not, to be very candid, not insurmountable. And the people we were interacting with were the people who were engaged with the agreed framework, the Perry process. These, and the North Koreans have, their people stay on the issue, and they work issues for 10, 15, 20 years. We tend to be, a little more, agile, and we move to different issues. They stay with the issue. The six-party process, I remember my first meeting in 2003, when I was told very clearly, Mr. Vitrani, the U.S. should just accept us as a nuclear weapons state and treat us like you treat Pakistan, and we'll be a good friend of the United States. I said, you know, that's not our policy. Our policy is comprehensive. It's comprehensive, verifiable, reversible dismantlement, but it's dismantlement. And they said, no, 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 we could be a good friend. And we said, listen, if you retain nuclear weapons, you build and you retain nuclear weapons, certainly South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, we're talking about a nuclear arms race in the region, and we're also talking about the possibility of getting this material out. And they said, look, and I share this here, this was in dialogue, and it's not in print, but this was in dialogue, and it was stark. It was, you know, Mr. DeCharney, if you don't accept this, well, we could build more nuclear weapons, and maybe those weapons could find its way out of here or get into the hands of others. And I said, you know, you don't want to say things like that. You don't want to say things like that, because if ever you built nuclear weapons, fissile material that got into the hands of anyone who used it against us or an ally, we would know and we would come after you. We would come after you. Don't go down that road. What that set for me was a mindset that this is what they wanted, and it didn't change in our negotiations. But however, many task force plenary sessions, a lot of interaction, we did achieve on the 19th of September 2005 a joint statement signed by Kim Jong-il, the father of Kim Jong-un, committing North Korea to comprehensive, verifiable, irreversible dismantlement of their of their ongoing nuclear weapons programs. And we made it very clear we're talking about uranium enrichment also. They signed up. They signed up to it. And on the other side, the 5 countries working with North Korea, on the other side, security assurances, a peace treaty, economic aid development assistance, the provision of a dialogue for the provision of light water reactors for civilian nuclear purposes once North Korea comes back to the NPT as a non-nuclear weapon state. And certainly, most importantly, because North Korea was so keen, and they are now, of normal relations with the United States, a dialogue to normalize relations. And in that regard, we said each country would have their bilateral issues. What gets you there is the denuclearization, the dismantlement and denuclearization. And the North Koreans responded and said, wait a minute. And then we would have the bilaterals, and we said, yes, because Japan has issues, the abductee issue, South Korea, the separated families, we, the United States, illicit activities, human rights, the gulags, counterfeiting our currency, counterfeiting basically pharmaceuticals, cigarettes. These need to be discussed. And the reaction was, well, we'll never get there then. We said, no, no, actions for actions. As they move to halt, you have to halt before you dismantle, we would then move, the corporate we, the 5, security assurances, peace treaty, energy assistance, economic development assistance, and then the beginning of a dialogue, liaison offices in our respective capitals. And in that process, you build trust, as we did, I believe, in the 6-party process. You got to know your interlocutors, and there's trust, and that's what's missing, because there is no trust right now. And we're missing, and that we built that, and we moved to that. Now, why did it come apart at the end of 2008? Because we moved from 2005 to 2008, and we did take the cooling tower down. We dismantled they dismantled parts there, and we had monitors these were monitors from the nuclear weapon states, the US, China, and Russia, because they were not part of the NPT, so there was not the IAEA at that moment. But we were in there looking at these things. It fell apart at the end of 2008. A question was asked of the first panel on monitoring and verification. We had commitments that to verify what they said on the dismantlement of all their nuclear weapons programs, our monitors would be able to leave Yongbyon, the plutonium facility, and visit other areas and take samples out and bring them to other countries to test them. The US, China, Russia, to test. And we had an oral agreement. And at the end of 2008, our lead negotiator, Christopher Hill at the time, said, we do need this in writing. And the North Koreans didn't want to put that in writing. So that to us was a very important factor. We said, look, our monitors need to be able to leave. We trust you, but trust would, you got to verify. And we need to be able to leave. These would be visits to other facilities, challenged inspections, if you will, but we'd be asking. And they said, we can't put this in writing. And that ended, and that was the end of 2008 and the beginning of 2009. And that unfortunately, we stopped the dismantlement, and so forth. But look at the progress we had there. We had momentum there. And I submit, because the Obama administration moved along those lines, and I'll look to the ambassador in a few minutes, but there was a lot of displeasure with North Korea, because when we had a new administration come in, the first reaction here was a nuclear test, a missile launch, and so forth. But we look at the agreed framework, the Perry process, and indeed the joint statement as indicative of the fact that you can get there. You can get there, because one of the things North Korea truly wants, and it gets back to what Lee Siegel said early in the conversation for the first panel, they want a normal relationship with the United States. Now, why they want that normal relationship, I think we could all understand that. This is North Korea. I'll end on this. 5,000 years of history, 2,000 years of recorded history. Of that 2,000 years of recorded history, over 500 invasions from China, from Mongolia, from Russia, from Japan. Of course, it's the Hermit Kingdom. They've been under siege for all these years. And of course, when they say we want nuclear weapons now, it's very understandable. And they use the term a nuclear deterrent, because they know if they have this, you'll stay away. And what we've always said is, you have normal relations with us, normal diplomatic relations with us. And that will be your best security assurances. And then we can integrate and come together.
Can I bring Mark in here
Yes.
on the crucial issue about trust, which is a message. Here, as in all negotiations, that negotiations in intractable conflicts have to overcome an initial high level of suspicion, animosity, mistrust, etc. But Mark, the problem of sanctions, how does that factor into this question of trust? We know that the research on international sanctions is not very positive. They have a low rate of effectiveness, and we know that they can be counterproductive. The question in the case of North Korea, as elsewhere, is whether the sanctions regime, bilateral and multilateral, is pushing the targeted party towards negotiations or away from negotiations.
Well, great question, and again, I'll associate myself with the panelists who've said this is a fantastic panel, a fantastic venue, and thanks to the University of Pennsylvania and all of the participants here today. I guess, great question, and what I'll do, maybe just back up just a step to dovetail off of what Joe said, is that, what was changing, right, when the Obama and Bush administrations were passing the torch, if you will. Everybody wants to focus on what was happening in Washington, but what was happening in North Korea was that Kim Jong-un's father likely had a major stroke and was essentially out of action. And you talked to Chris Hill, and his very last trip up to North Korea, he actually left from the Habib House, the ambassador's residence, and he was telling me the story, him and Kathy Stevens, actually, who was the ambassador at the time in South Korea. He said his last trip, he took that last trip and it just felt different. And he couldn't understand why at the time. And looking back now, we now have some indications that there was a major medical issue with Kim Jong-un's father at the time, and ostensibly led him to start running the country in earnest. So that was a major change, and I think we still have trouble grappling with that paradigm shift, and I'll get to the sanctions question through this issue, is that Kim Jong-un is not his father. He's very different. He is more black and white. The nuclear missile programs, Joe, tell me if I'm wrong here, but I'll quote Chris Hill again, is I think it's much less of a political gambit these days and much more of a military program that is really focused on getting a nuclear-tipped ICBM and perhaps a second strike capability, and then turning back towards political negotiations. But I think it underscores the fact why you need tests, right? You need tests not to send a political signal. You need tests right now to enhance the military efficacy of that program, to move technically down the line. So one, not his father. Two, more black and white. And three, I think the empirical data sort of bear out some of those facts. Remember, the Obama administration tried and got to an actual deal called the Leap Day deal, right? Glenn Davies, Joe, was he your successor, direct successor? Okay. Gave him the keys to the liquor cabinet. He thanks you for that at the State Department. But he went around and negotiated essentially, basically a moratorium on tests and nuclear tests and missiles in exchange for a release of humanitarian food aid and trying to get the the negotiations back on track, more or less. And Kim Jong-un took over right around the time of the Leap Day deal, and the Leap Day deal literally fell apart within weeks. It was the Kwangmyong-song launch. Then there was the purge of his uncle, and then there was a nuclear test in 2013, all in the span of a year. So this left, I think, an administration, I being among them, extremely committed to negotiations. Iran, Cuba, Myanmar, North Korea, and President Obama, and I was on his campaign in 2008, campaigned on those issues and took a lot of political heat, first from Hillary Clinton, then from John McCain, for being naive, but he was committed to those principles. So this left a very, I think, open administration inclined to negotiations, pragmatic in its approach, wondering what to do post-Leap Day deal. And I think that's starting in about 2012. I think the other data, too, that shows up is thinking of the Chonan, shelling of Yangpyeong-do Island, a much more belligerent, aggressive, black and white Kim Jong-un. And I think slowly we got to the point where we felt that sanctions were really the only option. There were three basic options that were outlined in the first panel: containment, some sort of military action, or negotiations. So how do you get Kim Jong-un back to the table? You try to change his calculus. And the data suggested that dropping exercises, entering into peace treaty negotiations, just relieving all the pressure, likely wouldn't work. He had undone a deal that had some momentum just a few years before. So I think what it basically suggested to us, and I think the Trump administration has picked up on this in some form, is that sanctions were really the least bad option. And reluctantly, I think the Obama administration came to a pressure strategy. And the pressure isn't to topple the regime. The pressure isn't to decapitate Kim Jong-un. The pressure isn't designed to punish the North Korean people. It's designed to one thing, at least in the Obama administration, was leave the door wide open to negotiations and hope that the pressure, working with the Chinese, who are a necessary part of the equation, because they really hold all the cards if you're going to run a pressure strategy, to get them back to the table. Last point I would say, on the pre-talks, we offered pre-talks in a very public way. Sung Kim, Joe's successor to removed, openly in the press, we held a press conference and said, I am prepared to come to Pyongyang and engage in pre-talks without conditions. And there was no receptivity. And I think, again, it goes into the general disposition of Kim Jong-un and the current leadership in Pyongyang, that it is a very black and white leadership. It is bent on one or two things, and it is very different from his father's leadership. And I'll close by saying, and this is all supported by, if you look at how he's running the country like his grandfather. He's dressing like his grandfather. He's reverting back to some of the traditions like his grandfather. And internally, and they'll never say this publicly, but remember, Kim Jong-un's father is seen as something of a failure. That's an overstatement in North Korea, but he presided over the decline of North Korea, happened to coincide with the collapse of the Soviet Union and massive reductions in economic aid, but also the negotiations were seen as a sign of weakness by some in North Korea. So he is very determined to run the country, much like his grandfather, and I think that sort of undergirds the overall direction. We'll stop there.
Thank you. I want to stay with the question of sanctions and its relationship to negotiations, because we know that sanctions can harden the intransigence of the target regime. There's lots of evidence of that. And especially if there is the perception on the part of the target regime that the objective is overthrow of the regime, then sanctions become counterproductive as far as negotiations are concerned. So a question to Eileen in relation to the UN and the UN Security Council, which passes a resolution most recently reinforcing multilateral sanctions. It also calls for a resumption of negotiations in just 2 lines in a long resolution. In other words, the UN Security Council's position on negotiations is muted. It's not absent, but it's not prominent. Should the Council not be more assertive, given its mandate in the Charter, to be encouraging and promoting negotiations? And in addition, what should the UN Secretary General be doing, who has a mandate for good offices, but appears to be very passive in respect to the North Korean crisis?
Well, from what I understand, just to be clear, I am not a North Korea expert, so I'm speaking to this as a person who studies negotiation and at both the track 1, which is the official level, and the track 2, which is the non-official level. My understanding at the moment of the situation from everyone who's spoken today and my background reading here is that more pressure from the Security Council is counterproductive, more pressure vis-a-vis sanctions. And I'm also not clear that more track 1 pressure vis-a-vis the UN Secretary General, even offering good offices, is the appropriate venue at the moment. It sounds as if both the strategy of the American presidency administration and the North Korean regime is threat, counter-threat, and an offer of negotiation by the Secretary General will probably be rebuffed, even done with good faith, etc. I'm wondering if instead the Secretary General might make some kind of statement about the commitment of the international community to resolving conflicts peacefully, not saying I will offer to mediate, but reminding these countries that as members of the international community, and especially if North Korea eventually over time would like to rejoin that community of nations, if that is where they would like to be, that the peaceful resolution of disputes is still the governing norm in the world. Reminding people, setting that tone. But I think progress at this moment seems to be possible only in a back channel or through a track 2 process, where a couple of things might happen. Number one, reassuring the North Korean regime, if we can, that there are people in the US administration who have a bit more, shall we say, political intelligence than is being communicated through our top leadership, and recognize that more nuance is needed and are looking for that nuance. I'm not sure that would be possible for them to do, but I think that would be a good kind of de-escalation step. The second is that I think the United States has to be much more strategic about what our actual interests are. It seems to me, again, looking at this as a negotiation analyst, that as many people on the previous panel and this panel have said, the actions of the United States are completely counter to our interests. We are operating in a demonizing way toward the North Koreans, and there's many reasons why that's true, historically and currently, but it makes any kind of positive gesture much less likely to do politically. And the more that we feed that demonization rhetoric, the less likely it is that anything can be done, either strategically or tactically, to de-escalate. We have to change the rhetoric. And I really believe that something has to be done on track 2 that is more than just a discussion about the nuclear issue in a narrow sense. One of the members of the last panel talked about transactional versus transformative strategy. And when I hear transformative, I'm thinking of relationship. When he said transformative, I think what he meant was decapitating the regime. I'd like to use transformative as a way of thinking about how we change the nature of the relationship between the two countries and stop creating this narrative that says we can't give anything to them because of who they are and what they stand for. Someone said, again in the last panel, we don't want to, I think it was the chairman, said, are we going to look like a chump? What a ridiculous way to conduct foreign policy. And yet, this is often what motivates states to take actions that they take. And it is totally counter to our interests to keep trying to to keep undermining our strategic interests by demonizing the other and tying our own hands. So just to say, I'm not sure the Secretary General as a mediator would be appropriate at this point, but maybe as a person to frame the relationship in a slightly different way.
And surely also as a voice that articulates the values and principles of the Charter
Exactly.
to which all member states are signatory.
Correct. That's what I would hope.
Tony, your expertise lies in international treaty negotiation. What are your insights from that research and experience that have a bearing on North Korea?
Well, for one thing, the United States has had a remarkably good record of compliance that we don't talk about very much. And we have had a remarkable record, however, of bringing other people to the table, acting as if we were totally involved and ready to move ahead, and then pulling out or not ratifying. So it's a very mixed and incoherent record, as I had written about back in 2009. And I think this is probably not the time yet for the United States to be thinking about new treaties. But I think that a rational policy, and I don't have any comfort that there will be a broad and rational policy, would be to change a quirky image of the United States into one of a reliable United States. And our interest in limiting proliferation and limiting the number of new members of the community of nations that are haves in the nuclear realm rather than have-nots, something that we have certainly spoken about, would involve actions that translate into a kind of negotiation apart from a negotiation with North Korea, such as finally acceding to the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. We're very worried, not only about a nuclear attack by North Korea or any other kind of attack, but by their extensive testing. We would like to bring them into the fold of those nations that don't test. We don't test in the atmosphere, but we haven't signed the treaty. So that's just an example of an action that is part of a negotiation that on the side, as it were. I think, and I don't know whether this administration has the personnel to do that or non-disparaged people to do that, is to really work with China, who cannot but be alarmed about North Korea's development of nuclear weapons also, to work with China in cooperation very quietly to see where our interests align with China on North Korea. And along with Eileen, I think Second Track has a huge potential here, and I would expect that to begin to flourish, that non-official people really exploring the possibilities. I think in the last panel, one of the most important things that was said was how much information we gather from just talking to North Korea, how much we can learn about what their interests are and what the threats to them are and what their threats to us are and are not. So I think we have to put a lot of strength into the Second Track, the informal negotiations of very capable people who are not now in government. And those would be some of the things that I think need to be done? Because I don't have a lot of hope that direct negotiations now on a freeze are going to go anywhere.
Okay. So it's quite a strong theme that emerged, I think, from the first panel and also this one. The importance of talks about talks, the importance of building confidence and trust prior to the commencement of negotiations. Yeah. How does one prepare the ground for that? And there's an emphasis on relationships as well as substantive issues.
Absolutely.
I think it certainly would correspond as a mediator. You know, often in high-level negotiations, the parties and international community are preoccupied with the substantive issues. From a mediator's perspective, what's critical is a change in their relationship from one of mutual and intense enmity to one of more normal political opposition before cooperation. Joseph, from your experience in the six-party talks, how does this fit in?
Well, let me just say, and these are good questions and excellent conversation. I think the track 2s and the track 1.5s, I've been involved with the track 1.5s, and we do get into everything. It's not just nuclear issues. We talk about human rights issues, we talk about what's going on with the illicit activities, and we tell them very clearly, and this is to the Vice Foreign Minister, now the former Vice Foreign Minister, now was the Foreign Minister, Yoon Ho, and now the current Vice Foreign Minister. These are pretty senior people, and we say, listen, you got to understand how you're viewed in the United States and with our allies in South Korea and Japan. I mean, what you're doing here is you're having these nuclear tests, you're launching these missiles, you're overflying Japan, you're basically saying we're going to, you have a U-2 that's taking out New York City and Washington. You've got this rhetoric, and you're following it up with all these violations of UN Security Council resolutions. Look, they are members of the UN Security Council, of the UN, and the Security Council has these resolutions on the books, and this is a response to their violations of, if you will, the missile tests and the missile launches, and so forth. So this is a manifestation of the displeasure. It's not that it's meant to be punitive. Hopefully, some of these sanctions do affect the traffickers who are in the business of arms sales, some of the units that build the nuclear weapons and the missiles and so forth. So it's a long way of saying I see sanctions not as, it's not the panacea. We know it's not going to resolve it, but there aren't many tools to respond to North Korea's basically telling the UN, we're members, but we don't have to listen to you. And these Security Council resolutions have no effect. There's some way of saying that you should be responsive. That's point one. Point two is we do speak to them. I think the track 2s and 1.5s are important. And we do cover all the issues there. And they need to understand how we view them, because they've been very provocative. And Ambassador Lippert indicated the Jonguns in 2010, they killed 47 sailors and the island and so forth. So we can go on and on that, and we don't. What we need to do is have more track 2s, 1.5s, but indeed what we need to have, ladies and gentlemen, and this is what we tell the North Koreans when we do meet with them, official talks. Sit down with American government officials and start building these relationships that we had in the past, and start talking about your security concerns, because they have real security concerns, and they really do want a peace treaty. They're still living in a state of war, and put it on the table and move in that direction. And that's why I think the ultimate thing is, if the 2s and the 1.5 track discussions could lend itself to formal talks, I think that would be positive and powerful, especially now when we're at this inflection point where North Korea basically is telling the U.S. we're on the cusp of becoming an existential nuclear threat to the United States, and what are you going to do about it? As they've been to South Korea and Japan over the years. This is very significant. Now's the time to engage.
But may I ask, though, obviously I haven't been part of these talks, but there is a quid pro quo, or there is a sort of mutuality in negotiation.
Right.
So yes, they have to see how we see them, but we also have to see how they see us.
Absolutely.
So what is the conversation about how the behavior and the attitudes? It's not just the behavior. It's the, as I mentioned earlier, it's really the decades of demonization of North Korea. probably some of it understandable. But the idea of monolithic, undifferentiated, and unalterably bad, and then taking actions that seem to amplify that. What are we willing to do, and how are we willing to change our attitudes and behaviors, thinking about how they're seeing us?
No, I think that's extremely important. I think as negotiators, we spend a great deal of time trying to understand our interlocutors. And we spend a great deal of time trying to have them understand us, because it's a two-way street. They need to understand us. I mean, this is the North Korea that did take the Pueblo, that did take down one of our reconnaissance planes in 1969 that was in international waters, and we lost 30 plus sailors. This is the same North Korea that had if you will, a commando squad go after the Blue House in 1967, take down Korean Airlines in 1988 because of the Seoul Olympics. Look, they've done some dastardly things, and we don't want to keep repeating that. But there's a reason why people, when they read these things, the axe killing in 1976 of our soldiers on the DMZ, this resonates with the American public when they see this as part of the history of dealing with North Korea. But you're right, and we take back their concerns. And their concerns are, look, we're under siege. We see your exercises as a threat to our government, as a decapitation exercise. We see sanctions as regime change. You're absolutely right on that. And we try to bridge that, and that's the value of negotiations. You want to bridge the gap.
Mark, do you want to come in here? You know, when we're involved in international mediation, you hear the parties criticize and blame each other all the time. And one response from a mediator is to say, well, you can't change the behavior of your opponent, but you can change your own behavior. So what's the challenge here to the US administration?
Well, I think, first, I would say, I think Joe's got it right in that you don't negotiate with who you want to negotiate with. You negotiate who's across the table from you, and you have to understand this regime, and it's a very dangerous, vicious regime, right? And its actions, you could go on. The Burma episode, there's a whole host of episodes. So this, and especially you look from his grandfather to Kim Jong-un, those two in particular, that's where the majority of this really vicious behavior, I think, is extant. The other point, I would just say is, so you have to, I think you have to just be analytically honest with who you're dealing with and what is the best approach forward. I think the second point is pragmatism, right? That I heard earlier, narrowing the scope of the negotiations. And look, I think that's what the international community has generally tried to do in the six-party talks, which is focus on the most serious threat, which is the nuclear weapons and missile programs, right? Which really is destabilizing on a non-proliferation, in a non-proliferation sense. It's really difficult in terms of UN Security Council resolutions, in terms of its membership and undermining international order. So I think there has been, a pragmatic focus under the Obama administration on what is probably the most urgent threat in those more narrowly defined. Doesn't mean we don't talk about the other issues like human rights. They have the worst human rights record probably in the world. And how you square that circle is a difficult dance, but I think pragmatism, as I said, too. And then I think three, going forward, if you're asking forward-looking into the future, if you ever got back into negotiations, I think the lesson you have with the North Koreans is it's a multi-step game, right? Is that that they are going to sign up to an agreement, they are going to try to renegotiate that agreement, they are likely going to try to cheat on that agreement. That's been the pattern of behavior. So I think you want to go in with that understanding in the original negotiations. I think you want to have really think through second, third, fourth, fifth steps. And third, I think, a friend of mine who negotiated with the North Koreans, I won't reveal her name, but she said, one thing, in addition to the tit for tat we did, kind of the action for action, one thing going forward we might do in the future would be to outline more of an end state, put more emphasis on what this could look like going forward, have that as a unified position between South Korea, China, and the US going forward. So there's not just the back and forth action for action, but there's an investment in what the end state could be. And so I think those kind of three lessons might be applicable here.
But what you haven't said is that our objective you might be clear in terms of an end state, but what are we willing to offer? What are we willing to offer North Korea that's of value to them?
Well, Joe hit it in the 2005 statement, is chock full of what they want. If you look back to the Bush administration, Bush 1, their demands essentially are the same as they are today, except I would add
Well, are you sure? Are you sure they're the same as they are today? They're in a very different position militarily today. Their demands can be greater. Do we even know what they are?
Yeah, I mean, they are negotiate the peace treaty. We want bilateral exercise reduced. We would like bilateral relations restored, or a dialogue or path to that. And then I think the new one, to your point, that they have changed, but those three are the real core ones. But the fourth one that is big and the hardest is recognition as a nuclear weapon state. Those are really their core demands.
I think the two priorities that they want most of all in the short term are some adjustment in the joint exercises. That would be put first. Second is some sanctions relief. Those would be the two priorities, and then all the other things that were mentioned in the short term. But there are two things I think the U.S. government could do today, if they really wanted to change the atmosphere, to make it more conducive to getting to talks. The first would be just simply stop the escalatory rhetoric. I know that's asking a lot, but really just stepping back from that, taking away the phone, doing what needs to be done. I don't know if that's within the realm of possibility, but that would really help. The second thing is to bring about some sense of policy coherence. What is our goals? What are our policy objectives with North Korea? You have on one day President Trump saying, I'll have a hamburger with Kim Jong-un. The next day, I'll never speak to the man. On one day, you have Tillerson saying we have 3 channels with the North Koreans now, so we are talking to him. And the next day, Vice President Pence saying we will not talk to this regime. And even Sarah Huckabee Sanders the other day said talks are not on the table right now. And then you have McMaster saying preventive war is an option. So for us here in the United States, where we have ample access to information, it's confusing to us. Can you imagine if you're sitting in Pyongyang, and I've been to Pyongyang, and I asked them, how do you get your information? And a lot of it is from watching CNN. A lot of it is from reading the tweets and things like that. So these are two things I would say would help make the atmosphere more conducive to something. And then looking forward to the notion of hostile policies. We hear this time and time from the North Koreans, that it's the hostile policy of the U.S. that needs to be dealt with. When they say hostile policies, we really need to ask them, and this is why track 1, track 2, track 1.5 and 2 is so important. What do you mean by hostile policies? Yeah. And I think it means 3 things right now. One is the decapitation exercises, the joint military exercises, which they see as so threatening. The second is the economic sanctions, which they see as denying them any economic progress to bring to their people. And the third is what I would call interference in domestic affairs, particularly human rights. Those are probably the 3 things they see as hostile policies. I think if that's what they mean by hostile policy, that's probably things we can deal with. We can negotiate over those things. Mm-hmm. But I would put that for a longer term discussion, and that's going to be a more arduous discussion. Up front, if we are going to engage the North Koreans, we need to get an early win. We need to build a little trust and find a way to get to a point where, like we did with the Iranians, before we had this final deal, we had something called an interim agreement. And I think we should follow that model. And I would put forward a freeze on their testing and missile program, which would be easier to verify than some of the other things that were discussed in the first panel. And in exchange, I think what they would really like is some reduction and adjustment of the military exercises and maybe some sanctions relief. So that's a starting point to begin discussions. And I think before we get to tackling the big problems, the hostile policies, we need to focus, again, like we did with the Iranians, on something small first and build from there. And that would be my approach or my advice to this administration.
You know, Susan, in the track 1.5 meetings we had with the Vice Foreign Minister, who's now the Foreign Minister, Yoon Ho, we said exactly what you said.
I think we're talking to the same person.
Well, but you see, and the Obama administration was prepared to do that.
Yes,
They said they weren't going to talk to the Obama administration.
yes.
So we had an administration that was saying, we will talk about reducing joint military exercises and loosening up on sanctions if you stop what you're doing on missile launches and nuclear tests, and let's just come together, officials. And they said, no, we don't want to talk to the Obama administration.
It's also the Chinese proposal is a freeze for a freeze, and they've rejected that outright.
So, I mean, you know, so we have now a new administration coming in, and you said it correctly, saying, I'll have hamburgers with them, and we can just sit down. But during that process, we see ICBMs and intermediate-range ballistic missiles and Guam and nuclear tests and thermonuclear tests and so forth, and the UN Security Council really saying, my God, what's going on here? But nonetheless, we should be having these discussions, and hopefully that's what Tillerson is saying. But I think he doesn't make it a condition, but I think he's saying, let's talk, but when we talk, don't be launching missiles and having nuclear tests. That's not right. It's like having a gun to our head. Stop doing that. Maybe we could talk.
I want to open this up to the audience to put your questions and your comments. Your disagreement is welcome. But just to note how sophisticated this discussion is in terms of a framing of the problem, which has not been put in terms of black and white, but an attempt to understand the position of the other, an understanding of incremental progress or incremental phases of negotiations, the idea of interim agreements that might build confidence leading to stronger agreements down the line is a much more sophisticated way of understanding tough negotiations than I think we're seeing, certainly in the public realm at the moment. I want to take 3 questions at a time, and then the panelists can respond, and we'll take that as long as we can, as long as time permits. So let's start over here with the gentleman in the blue. Can you wait for the mic? Yeah, thanks.
A major theme of this panel, obviously, is Track 2 negotiations, 1.5, 1.75, who knows? And I'm familiar with that in the Middle East, not in the Korean Peninsula. But my sense of Track 2 negotiations is they don't work. There's a subtle relationship to the people who would do the Track 1. You can't be, they can't be your supervisors, but they have to be your audience. That is, they happen to be open to hearing what you learn to make this thing work. And in recent weeks, there's been so much attention to the President and the Secretary of State not being on the same track, about the State Department itself and the diplomatic corps being so, in some ways, you know, I'm not going to use the nuclear word, but it's been in some ways a real problem. So the question I have for any of you, maybe Suzanne particularly, is one of the major challenges here that there isn't an audience in Washington for Track 2 negotiations. And the other factor I would throw into that hopper is we have an administration very concerned about loyalty. And Track 2 requires trusting people who don't directly work for you and aren't necessarily loyal to you, at the same time serving your interests. Any comments about the viability of Track 2 negotiations under these circumstances?
Great, thank you. I'm going to take 2 more questions. Let's stay on the right. Am I right? Thanks, Itay.
Thank you. And a final comment by Ambassador Lippert. I finally heard South Korea mentioned, first time all afternoon. And, you know, one of the reasons bilateral negotiations have been obstructed in the past is because South Korea should be at the table and they're our ally, and we've had a long policy of not going to the table without them. I mean, I'd like just some perspective here on South Korea's role in coming to negotiations. And after all, it is their country. They were the ones who were invaded. And when we're gone, they're still going to be there.
Good. Thank you. And I'll take one more on this side, and then I'm going to move to, so I'll take the young fellow in the uniform.
Thank you very much. I had read speculations that the North Korean nuclear test program has accelerated to the point that it might be explained by a third party or nation assisting them in the testing of nuclear weapons. And I was wondering how the existence of such a party or lack thereof should change the tack from which the United States should approach the negotiation table with the North Korea.
Good, thank you. So I'm going to invite the panelists to respond. I would simply highlight the importance of the question of South Korea because we haven't looked adequately yet at the regional dynamics. It's a mistake, we all know, to treat this as a bilateral issue, even if there are two prominent, or most prominent players in terms of the rhetoric and escalatory dynamics. But we have to take into account all the key actors. And so I think we need to say a little more about that with respect to negotiations. We also have to have the additional questions, but I leave this to you.
Want me to start on?
Sure, Mark,
okay,
you can kick off on.
Snapping, I have two small children. They keep me up at night. So, you know, I took a breather.
You can bring in lessons from
well, I'll take the South Korea question, then maybe broaden it a little bit to the region. But first of all, excellent question, and that's what I did for 2.5 years. North Korea was, obviously part of the job. But if you go to South Korea and you only look at South Korea through the North Korea lens, you are missing 90% of the country, right? I mean, it is, I'll just give a 2-second promotion. It's an amazing place that, quite frankly, looks less and less like North Korea each and every day. And what's interesting is that the youth in South Korea, support for reunification is actually dropping. It's dropping because they're distant, you don't have the familial ties. In some ways, South Korea, it's the most wired country on earth, and people are connected more with people in Southeast Asia or in the United States than a country that has no internet connectivity whatsoever. So it's really interesting to watch this play out as the dynamics between North and South get further and further apart in generational cleavages. Now, you go to the older generations, they have family there. The Red Cross talks are critical. They still, I'll just give you one, it's a current diplomat, it's a high-level diplomat in South Korea. He was involved in the six-party talks. Joe, you probably know him. And he was on his way up to North Korea, and the North Koreans were driving a bus, and the delegations were on the buses, and they were up that way, and there was a fork in the road, and one fork went to his father's hometown, and the other went to where the six-party talks were going to be held, and he pleaded with the driver to pull over so he could take one stone and put it on his father's grave, right? And that's how real it is to that older generation. So it's quite a contrast. As far as and I just think it's important you never forget the human dimension of what this means to the South Koreans. So that's point one. Point two, just quickly on the policy side, a more sort of less emotive, but look, you cannot run a good North Korea policy without alignment with South Korea. You just can't do it. We kind of tried it in the 90s. It was sloppy. I think we learned from our mistakes, let's put it that way. So I spent a lot of time making sure that the US was in alignment with the South Koreans on North Korea policy. And it was a lot of 2 a.m. phone calls, a lot of visits to the ministry late at night, but that is hard work, but you have to have it. The final point I'll just say, and we could go on just on South Korea, is look, there is this other channel, right, that people forget. You've got the six-party talks, that's the big nuclear missile security talks, but remember you have the inter-Korean channel too. Right? That's been pretty dormant of late. The last time it was really active was 2015. I thought that there was going to be real progress in that channel, and it was very interesting. An administration that was, I think, wrongly painted as overly hardline, Park Geun-hye, I think she ran a more for more strategy towards the north. They were ready to move forward on a whole host of items. The only thing that they wanted was among a list of 40 issues that they wanted to talk to the North Koreans, and they were talking, trying to negotiate, they were in pre-talks, trying to get the agenda set. They said, we have to talk about the nuclear missile programs. And the North walked out, never to return. So Moon Jae-in, in comes the left-wing president, left of center president, widely respected, very popular in South Korea. He's tried very hard to reopen that channel to no avail. I always felt in the administration, and I would impart this advice to anybody who works on Korean issues, let the inter-Korean channel go. I mean, I think in terms of don't have the U.S. overly involved. You know, obviously have a good consultative strategy, try to embed it in what you're trying to do larger, but that's really for the Koreans, right? And they have made progress in the past in that channel, the 91-92 agreement to denuclearize the peninsula, so on and so forth. So that's an interesting channel. It's dormant right now. I think it speaks more about Kim Jong-un than it does Moon Jae-in, and I think it's something that we should watch carefully, and I'll stop there on South Korea.
Thank you, Mark. Yeah, you can.
Oh, thank you.
Excellent.
Is it due to my kids and dog? No, thank you. Thank you.
Any of the others on the question of track 2 and the need for an audience for track 2?
Yeah, I would really like to hear from the rest of the panel about whether there is an opportunity, whether there are candidates within the administration who would hear the input from a track 2 and do. I mean, and I'm particularly concerned or interested about the Secretary of Defense, the National Security Advisor. I mean, people who could be counted on or counted on to reduce the escalatory risk, even if the rhetoric is horrible, that actions might be contained.
Let me look to Susan. Let me just start that. Look, when we come back from a track 1.5, we're not being asked by the government to go out there. We tell the government we're going out there. They say, go for it. When we come back, we see government, the National Security Council at State Department, our representative at State Department, Ambassador Joe Yun. We see these people and we say, we had these discussions and we said A, B, C, D, and this is what they said and it's their concern. So we do go back, at least the colleagues I've been with, and Lee Siegel was one of them on a panel this morning or this afternoon. We do go back and they're not asking us to do it, but we give a debrief and we say this is what's transpired and so forth. So I think it does have impact, Susan.
So my approach to track 2, and in this case of North Korea, it's really track 1.5. So on our side, it's former U.S. senior officials, former military leaders, and experts. On their side, because it is North Korea, it is all officials. I've been running and continue to run a long-term track 2, track 1.5 with Iran for the past 16 years and have been able to hone some best practices on how to approach this. And also starting in 2009, initiated a track 2 with Myanmar, track 1.5, right before the transition happened. So I think it's just as Joe said, you have to be very disciplined and reach out to the government, but at the same time, you're independent from the government. You're non-governmental, and you should never have any doubt about that. What I can tell you about this current administration, and it may surprise you on the North Korea track 2, we had a meeting in May, and I can talk about this is because it's been reported in the press, in that meeting, the Trump administration authorized a U.S. official to come to Oslo with us, and that official did have direct talks with the head of the North Korean delegation, who is a fairly senior level diplomat. Those talks did lead ultimately to the release of Otto Warmbier. It was a tragic outcome, certainly wasn't the outcome we expected. So that's an example of how track 1.5 and track 1 can actually work quite well together.
Yeah.
And I think in this case, we provided the cover for the Trump administration official to come meet them, and it then led to additional talks on this one very specific issue, the release of U.S. prisoners. But we need to get to a point where those discussions can go beyond, as important as the U.S. prisoner issue is, and it always should be one of our first priorities, beyond other issues. So that's something that takes work, it takes time, it takes, the fact of the matter is we call this the digital age, but what we're doing right now, communicating face to face, nothing is ever going to take the place of that. And that's especially true when you're talking about dialogue with adversaries.
Yeah.
There's nothing that's going to take the place of that. So people, I think, that do track 2, track 1.5 understand that. I think we're constantly pushing, prodding, poking for opportunities for direct contact, because each time we have contact, we learn.
Yeah.
We learn a lot. We also can convey messages. And of course, when we get back, we have meetings, debriefs with all parts of the government. And also the Hill, by the way, is a very important player in all these issues. So interacting with Congress as well.
Great,
And
thank
of course, briefing other experts.
I want to turn back to the audience, since we are pressed for time, to give you another...
That nuclear question.
Yes.
They're independent, they're self-reliant. North Korea is doing it on their own. They're capable. It's uranium enrichment, it's plutonium. They've got capabilities that are unreal. We've always underestimated North Korea on their nuclear missile capabilities, but also cyber, chemical, biological. They have the full spectrum, and they put a lot of smart people on it, and they focus. And now in that regard, they are self-reliant.
Thank you, Joseph. Indications, yep. Attain? In the front, thanks.
So there was a suggestion that one of the things that bothers North Korea most are our joint exercises. Assuming that the babysitters could educate the baby to keep his mouth shut, and we were able to convey an idea that perhaps we would be willing to forego the joint exercises for a while, what would we be looking for in return to begin to get some kind of dialogue and some kind of show of good faith so that we could maybe have further discussions? In other words, what would be the first thing that we would want from North Korea? Obviously not if we're going to a nuclear program, but how could we begin? How could we begin to trading off the things we want against what they want?
Well,
Good. Any other indications? Claire.
I have a question that ties together this discussion with the discussion that we had in the last panel. If it is a precondition for effective talks from Korea that we ensure that we're not seeking regime change, and if we're staring at a history of massive human rights violations and brutalities, violations of sovereignty of other countries and so on, then what about the normative, moral question of are we just collaborating in maintaining the existence of a regime that we'd rather get rid of as a precondition for entering into negotiations with?
Well, there's a big existential and normative challenge. I'm going to invite Eileen to kick off a response on that.
Yeah. Huge question. Again, I think we have to think about the objective. If we want the behavior of the regime to change, it's clear, it's been demonstrated that the strategies that we've been using don't work to get the change you're talking about. They don't work. They haven't worked to stop human rights abuses, etc. What seems to have worked, if I understand correctly, is when the regime has felt, and I know how abhorrent it is, I can hear the rhetoric. They're vicious, is a word that Mark used. The history, all the things that the Pueblo, there's a laundry list of horrible things. The problem is if we keep holding them accountable and making that a prerequisite that they have to be punished for all of those things before we engage or before we allow them to gain anything, then we don't get the objective we're looking for. They won't. They've shown that pressure is not the way to lead to change. Engagement will lead to change. It may be that accountability never comes. I'm sorry to say, but it may be that future behavior will be better if they get the respect and the the reciprocity that they seem to be seeking, which may be a huge lump in the throat to have to swallow.
Okay.
But the other, which is pushing for accountability, isn't working either.
Penny?
So can I just add on that? Because that was part of our joint statement in 2005. If you want normal diplomatic relations with the United States, you have to make progress to sit down with us on denuclearization, and we would move towards a peace treaty, economic aid development, light water reactors, but normal diplomatic relations. We may have liaison officers, normal diplomatic relations. You need to address human rights, illicit activities, the issues that you're talking about, the issues that speak to our values. And the same thing for South Korea. You said you have to deal with the South Koreans on separated families, their issues, the abductees with Japan. And therefore, each of the countries then would sit down with the North Koreans and discuss those issues that are critical to them based on their values. So to answer your question, and I agree with that, it gets us to this dialogue by addressing the nuclear issue, the missile, but certainly the nuclear issue. It gets us to a dialogue on your questions. But it doesn't give them exactly what they want until they have some progress. They're not going to resolve it overnight. They said they can never do that. But some transparency into those issues, some benchmarks, some progress towards it. I think that's movement in that direction. Many of us think it's a very moral way of approaching what we offer, and that's normal diplomatic relations.
Penny?
Why impose conditions on North Korea that we don't impose on other countries that we recognize?
Right.
I mean, just look at some of the African countries with egregious practices, and we don't, for recognition and for even dealing with them on some economic issues, we don't demand normative conditions. Their countries, we have ambassadors to them, we have relations with them. Why do we expect that we will get a positive response from North Korea about changing their system to conform with a set of, that they would, respond to all the conditions of the various human rights treaties that exist in the world?
Well, your point's a good point. We do have relations with those countries, so therefore it's a question of breaking relations with countries that do not meet our human rights standards.
Well,
That's a different issue.
in that case, we'd break relations
So we would,
with a third of the
right.
countries
But
in the world.
It's a little easier dealing with a country that does want relations with us. And that we're saying this is it's not a very, we don't think it's a very high bar not to counterfeit our currency or to sell methamphetamine or to counterfeit our cigarettes and pharmaceuticals and to have over 200,000 people in gulags and have some transparency. We don't think it's a high bar. This is a country that wants normal relations, and we're saying we're prepared to have liaison officers, we're prepared to have a dialogue. We're not saying you have to, at least we were with the joint statement, have to address all of them 100%.
Well, we have relations with the Soviet Union.
But that's the point. We have relations. This is a country that wants relations. So if you want relations, this is the bar you have to meet. Unfortunately, we didn't have those bars when we established relations with the Soviet Union.
But does it make sense? Does it make sense in the big picture?
They were never the impediments in the negotiations, right? So, I mean, it's the fact of the matter is the negotiations centered around the nuclear missile programs, and they rose and fall on the issues related to those areas in the dialogue. That's where the deals fell apart. That's where they came together. You can have this discussion. It's a very interesting one. You could throw in Vietnam as a really interesting case study as well into that. But I would just say the central issue in the negotiations over the past 25 years have been nuclear weapons and missile programs, and the deals have rose and fall on those. Just quickly on exercises, I'm not in favor of giving away exercises, and I'm not in favor of giving away the peace treaty unless and until down the road, right? I think the 2005 joint statement talks about the peace treaty negotiated in parallel with the nuclear and missile programs. And I think that is actually a pretty interesting way to proceed. Remember also that deal was a pretty good deal. The reason it kind of fell apart was all the banking issues, right, that came out of kind of sideways. So, and that undermined all of the trust and kind of blew the whole deal apart. So I think there is a pretty good foundation. It's now getting pretty old. It's 12, 13 years old. But that was a pretty instrumental agreement. The big difference is Kim Jong-un is in charge, not his father. And then on exercises, I would say, look, just the data show that counterintuitively, first, remember, we gave away team spirit, we stopped it. It was by far the most provocative exercise we ran on the Korean Peninsula. Big, provocative, really realistic. We stopped it, and it was pocketed. Nothing really changed as a result. So there is data in that direction, a data of one, but it was our biggest exercise. And what I would say on Iran, what people overlook, and I'll stop on this, is that counterintuitively, I'm a big supporter in negotiations and really want to get in that. But remember what we did in Iran. There was a lot of pressure applied to the Iranians, both in sanctions, but also we kept 2 aircraft carriers right in the Persian Gulf for a long, long time. And every time an aircraft carrier moved out, tactical aircraft came into the Gulf states behind it. So the Iranians knew that. They didn't like it, but it clearly pressurized them to get back to the table. And the other piece of pressure on the Iran deal was the Israelis. They weren't sure what the Israelis were going to do. So that I just don't think in this case, if you removed all the pressure, you have to ask yourself, do you think Kim Jong-un would come back to the table? Do you think he would start negotiating immediately? And I think his record in office tends to lead one to no at this point.
I would just say, in the case of Iran, we had all this pressure, but it was within a broader policy, right?
That's fair. And a clear door open to negotiation,
exactly. So
wide
you can
open.
argue that the Obama administration hit that sweet spot of pivoting to engagement. And then let's not forget that during the talks about talks, we had a very capable diplomatic team who was able to convey to the Iranians a couple of things that I really think turned the page. One was they were able to reassure them that the U.S. strategic policy objective towards Iran was no longer regime change. And secondly, they were able to convey to them a change in policy. The former policy was zero enrichment. And now the U.S. was prepared to live with a heavily verified, monitored uranium enrichment program on Iranian soil. So sanctions, pivoting to engagement, those sort of, I wouldn't call them concessions, but maybe I'd call them concessions, really made this deal possible.
Very fair. And that was sort of my point, which is you need a comprehensive policy that
and
elements
I
all
guess what
elements
we're
of
not saying is we don't have the comprehensive policy on North Korea.
We've reached the end of this session, but I know that Joseph indicated you wanted to make some final remarks. Our boss is poised to assert his authority. So,
I just wanted on that question on military and right on the mark. But what we would like to see, I would think right now, is for North Korea to stop its nuclear tests and missile launches before they really get to that point where they are an existential nuclear threat to the U.S. Because then it makes it's a different equation in that regard. I mean, the South Koreans and the Japanese have been living with this, but it really changes a lot of that. And it's not stopping. We're not doing a freeze for freeze. We would never do that because the joint military exercises are defensive in nature, based on these are defensive in nature. But we have done in the past, we've scaled some back. That could be done, the same thing with sanctions and so forth. And that would be the sine qua non. They could stop what they're doing there if they want that badly. To include also a discussion on some of the other security concerns.
I want to thank all of you for your active participation. I want to thank the organizers for hosting this, and especially to thank the panelists. This has been rich and enlightening. And I would encourage the organizers to take the panelists down to DC tomorrow to the White House where they can present a sophisticated approach to it.
Many thanks, Laurie, for moderating and for your help putting the program together. We're going to take about a 25-minute break. At 5 o'clock, we'll reconvene for the keynote program with Governor Bill Richardson and David Sanger of the New York Times. We'll see you all back here in just under half an hour.